Federal agents swarmed Atlanta International Airport as black SUVs lined the runway. Inside Terminal B, Major Marcus Washington sat quietly while chaos erupted around him. 10 minutes earlier, gate agent Karen Miller had sneered at his military ID. "This isn't real," she'd said. She would soon regret those words. Before we dive into this incredible story of dignity in the face of discrimination, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this kind of real-life drama interests you, hit that like button and subscribe to catch more untold stories of American heroes who faced injustice. Now let's rewind to see how a routine flight turned into a national incident that would change airport policy forever. The morning sun filtered through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport's Terminal B, casting long shadows across the polished floor as Major Marcus Washington made his way through the bustling crowd. At 68 years old, the Black Medal of Honor recipient moved with the measured pace of a man who had seen too much of the world to ever be in a hurry again. His weathered hands gripped a small leather carry-on containing everything he needed for the trip to Washington, D.C., including the nation's highest military decoration tucked safely in its velvet-lined case. Marcus was traveling to receive a special presidential commendation, an honor that stirred mixed emotions within him. As he navigated through the terminal, memories flickered through his mind like an old film reel, transporting him back to the jungles of Vietnam, where he had earned his Medal of Honor. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But what it didn't mention was how the same country that awarded him that medal had treated him upon his return home. The uniform had earned him respect in certain circles, but his skin color had overshadowed his service in far too many others. Throughout his military career and civilian life afterward, Marcus had faced discrimination that cut deeper than any enemy weapon ever could. Today was no different, he noticed, as he observed the subtle shifts in body language from fellow travelers, the quick glances, the slight adjustments in trajectory to avoid walking too close to him. Despite his impeccably pressed suit and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, to some he was still just a black man who didn't belong in their space. The special military identification card in his wallet carried weight in official capacities but had proven useless against prejudice countless times before. His military bearing remained intact after all these years, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes forward. But behind his calm exterior lay decades of trauma, both from the horrors of war and the persistent sting of racial discrimination that had followed him from the battlefield to the boardroom. The terminal was particularly crowded today, with frustrated travelers clustered around monitors displaying delayed and cancelled flights. Marcus observed the subtle distinctions in how staff treated different passengers, the extra smiles for some, the curt responses for others who looked like him. Near the coffee stand, a young black woman was being questioned about her payment card, while the white businessman before her had been waved through without a second glance. Marcus had seen this dance too many times to count. When his boarding time approached, he made his way toward Gate 27, where privileged passengers were already forming a line for priority boarding. His first-class ticket had been an unexpected upgrade, a gesture from the airline after learning of his commendation ceremony. He approached the counter with his boarding pass and ID ready, only to be met with the dismissive glance of gate agent Karen Miller, a 35-year-old white woman whose customer service smile vanished the moment she looked up from her computer screen to see him standing before her. Her eyes flickered with surprise, then narrowed slightly as she noted his expensive suit contrasted against his dark skin. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting he had approached the wrong counter, despite the clear first-class boarding sign above her head. Marcus could feel the familiar weight of prejudice settling over the interaction like a dark cloud, but as he had done countless times before, he chose the path of dignity over confrontation. First-class boarding. Karen Miller's voice carried across the waiting area, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Her emphasis on first class hung in the air like an accusation, the implication clear to everyone within earshot. Marcus nodded politely, sliding his boarding pass and military ID across the counter. "Yes, ma'am, seat 2A. Karen made no attempt to hide her skepticism as she examined his documents. holding his military ID up to the light as though checking for a watermark. "Medal of Honor recipient?" she read aloud, her tone dripping with disbelief. "This doesn't look like any military ID I've seen before." Marcus maintained his composure, though his heart rate quickened slightly. "It's a special identification issued to recipients of the Medal of Honor," he explained quietly, conscious of the growing audience around them. "I can show you my regular military ID as well, if that would help." Karen's laugh cut through the gate area like a knife. "Sure, let's see that too. People like you don't usually fly first class with us." Her emphasis on people like you caused several passengers in line to shift uncomfortably, while others exchanged knowing glances or even snickered in agreement. Marcus felt each slight like a physical blow, but decades of similar encounters had taught him to keep his expression neutral. As he reached for his wallet to produce his standard military ID, a young black airport employee named James Watkins stepped closer to the counter. At 24, James had recognized the elderly gentleman immediately from a documentary he'd watched in college about overlooked military heroes. "Ma'am," James began cautiously, "that's actually a legitimate—" Karen cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I'm handling this, James. Please return to your station." James hesitated, looking from Karen to Marcus with an expression of helpless frustration before reluctantly stepping back. Marcus handed over his standard military ID, which Karen examined with the same exaggerated scrutiny. As she held both IDs in her hand, comparing them with theatrical suspicion, Marcus's mind drifted to another time when his identity had been questioned. He'd been in uniform then, fresh from receiving his Medal of Honor, trying to check into a hotel where his white fellow officers had been welcomed minutes before. The memory blurred into dozens of similar moments throughout his life. Restaurants where he'd been seated by the kitchen despite reservations, stores where security followed him closely, neighborhoods where police stopped him for simply existing. But the sharpest memory was of Richard Collins, his best friend in Vietnam, a white man from rural Georgia who had initially treated Marcus with the casual racism of his upbringing. Richard, who had eventually become his closest ally. Richard, who had died in Marcus's arms during the very battle that earned Marcus his medal, whispering, "They gotta see you now, Wash. They gotta see you for who you really are." Karen's voice snapped him back to the present. "I'm going to call security," she announced loudly. "I believe this man is attempting to board with fraudulent documentation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus remained still, his expression betraying nothing of the pain and rage churning beneath his calm exterior. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I've held this identification for over 50 years. I assure you, it's authentic." Karen ignored him, already, reaching for the phone. "Security to Gate 27, she spoke into the receiver. "Possible case of identity fraud and attempted use of counterfeit military credentials." As Marcus stood at the counter, enduring the stares and whispers of fellow passengers, he thought again of Richard Collins. They had started as reluctant squadmates, Richard initially refusing to even share a foxhole with a black soldier. But war had a way of stripping men down to their essence, and Richard had eventually seen past the color of Marcus's skin to the quality of his character. Their friendship had developed slowly, painfully at times, as Richard unlearned the prejudices of his upbringing. By the time of the ambush that would claim Richard's life, they had become brothers in every way that mattered. Now, standing at Gate 27 with his dignity under assault, Marcus held onto the memory of Richard's final words, like a talisman against the humiliation spreading through him like poison. 2 security officers arrived at Gate 27 with alarming speed, their hands hovering near their tasers as they approached Marcus as though he were an imminent threat. The taller officer, a white man with a crew cut and rigid posture, immediately positioned himself between Marcus and the rest of the waiting area, while his partner, a stockier man with a perpetual scowl, stood directly in front of the elderly veteran. "Sir, we need to see your identification," the second officer demanded, despite the fact that Marcus's military IDs were still in Karen's possession on the counter. "The gate agent has my identification," Marcus replied calmly, gesturing toward. Karen, who held the documents between her fingertips as if they might contaminate her. "She believes they're fraudulent." The first officer took the IDs from Karen, examining them with the same performative skepticism she had displayed. "Medal of Honor?" he questioned, his tone making it clear he found the very idea laughable. "Where did you get this, sir?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus had faced such questions before, the assumption that anything valuable in his possession must have been stolen or counterfeit. "I received it from President Nixon in 1971, he answered steadily, "for service in Vietnam." The second officer snorted. "And I'm Neil Armstrong," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Several passengers laughed, emboldened by the officer's open disrespect. Marcus remained silent, his military training on full display, as he stood at parade rest, eyes forward, expressionless. A small crowd had begun to form around the confrontation, with most onlookers assuming that the security officers and gate agent must be in the right. After all, why would authorities question an elderly man without cause? James Watkins, the young airport employee who had attempted to intervene earlier, watched the scene unfold with growing distress. When the officers turned their backs momentarily to confer with Karen, James slipped away, pulling his phone from his pocket as he ducked into a service corridor. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through his contacts, looking for someone who might be able to help. The security officers returned their attention to Marcus, their demeanor growing increasingly aggressive. "Sir, impersonating a military officer is a federal offense," the first officer stated loudly. "We're going to need you to come with us for questioning." Marcus looked from one officer to the other, then to the gate agent, recognizing a familiar pattern. He had seen this before, the escalation of a minor incident into something that could become dangerous for someone who looked like him. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I would like to make it clear that I am not impersonating anyone. I am Major Marcus Washington, United States Army, retired. My service record can be easily verified." The second officer reached for Marcus's carry-on bag. "We'll need to search your belongings." Before Marcus could respond, the officer had unzipped his leather bag and begun roughly rummaging through its contents. When his hand emerged holding the velvet case containing the Medal of Honor, Marcus felt a flash of genuine alarm. "Please, be careful with that," he said, his voice taking on an edge for the first time. What's this?" the officer interrupted, flipping open the case to reveal the medal inside. "This what you're trying to pass off as yours?" He held it up for his partner to see, handling the nation's highest military decoration as casually, as if it were a trinket from a gift shop. As the medal dangled from the officer's fingers, Marcus was transported back to the day he'd received it. How out of place he'd felt in the White House, the only black face in a sea of white ones. How even on that day of supreme honor, he'd endured sidelong glances and whispered comments. He remembered how later that same night, a taxi had refused to pick him up outside his hotel. The medal hadn't changed how the world saw him then, and it wasn't changing anything now. The airport manager arrived, a middle-aged white woman in a crisp suit, who took in the scene with a quick assessing glance before turning to Karen for an explanation. She nodded as Karen spoke, occasionally glancing at Marcus with the same predetermined judgment. When Karen finished, the manager approached. "Sir, I understand there's some confusion about your documentation. I'm afraid we can't allow you to board at this time." She held out her hand. "I'll need to take your boarding pass until this matter is resolved." Marcus surrendered his boarding pass, watching as another door closed on him because of assumptions made about his skin. Would you stand up against injustice if you saw it happening right in front of you? Or would you look the other way? Comment number 1 if you believe security went too far in their treatment of Major Washington. Or number 2, if you think they were just doing their jobs. Hit that like button if you're shocked by how quickly this situation escalated from a simple boarding procedure to a public humiliation. Subscribe to follow Major Washington's story as it unfolds, now with his dignity under assault and his precious medal in the hands of those who disrespected its significance, who would step forward to witness this injustice. Aisha Johnson had been sitting at the adjacent gate, nose buried in her American history textbook, when the commotion caught her attention. The 21-year-old black college student looked up just in time to see security officers surrounding an elderly black man in a well-tailored suit. Something about the scene triggered her instincts. Perhaps it was the man's dignified bearing in contrast to the officer's aggressive posture, or perhaps it was simply that she'd seen this story play out too many times before. Slipping her book into her backpack, Aisha moved closer, pretending to check the departure board while discreetly removing her phone from her pocket. As one of the officers dangled what appeared to be a medal from his fingers, Aisha recognized the distinctive star-shaped design from her history class, the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. Without hesitation, she began recording, making sure to capture not only the elderly man's face, but also the expressions and actions of the security officers and gate agent. Aisha positioned herself strategically, angling her phone to catch the airport manager's dismissive gesture as she confiscated the man's boarding pass. Karen noticed the recording first, her eyes widening with alarm before narrowing in anger. "Excuse me," she called out to Aisha. "Photography and recording are not permitted in the secure area of the terminal." It was a lie, and Aisha knew it. "Actually," she replied calmly, continuing to record, "TSA regulations permit photography in the publicly accessible areas of the airport, including the gates, as long as it doesn't interfere with the screening process." The security officers turned toward her, the medal still dangling carelessly from one officer's hand. "Miss, we're going to need you to stop recording and delete that footage immediately," the taller officer demanded. "This is an airport security matter." Aisha stood her ground. "I'm well within my rights to record in a public area," she responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And this doesn't look like a security matter to me. It looks like harassment." The second officer approached her, hand extended. "I need to see your ID and boarding pass, and I need you to surrender your phone under airport security protocols." Again, Aisha knew this was an overreach of authority. "I'm happy to show my ID and boarding pass," she said, "but I will not be surrendering my phone. There is no such protocol that allows you to confiscate personal devices for recording in public areas." As the officer continued to insist, Aisha made a quick decision. With a few taps on her screen, she started a live stream to her social media account, where she had a modest following from her campus activism. "I'm currently at Atlanta International Airport," she narrated quietly as she streamed, "where security officers and staff are detaining what appears to be an elderly veteran with a Medal of Honor. They've confiscated his military ID and are handling his medal disrespectfully." The number of viewers on her live stream began to tick upward immediately. One viewer commented, "That's the Medal of Honor. Who is he?" Another wrote, "Can you get his name? Veterans will want to know about this." A third, "That's no way to treat that medal. Disgraceful." As the confrontation continued, the live stream audience grew exponentially, with military veterans in particular expressing outrage at the treatment of both the elderly man and the medal itself. Comments poured in identifying the distinctive characteristics of the Medal of Honor and demanding to know the veteran's name so they could verify his service. Karen was becoming increasingly agitated as she realized Aisha was not only continuing to record, but was now broadcasting the incident live. "Security!" she called. "She needs to be removed from the gate area." The officers seemed torn between continuing their harassment of Marcus and addressing this new challenge to their authority. Taking advantage of their momentary distraction, Aisha edged closer to Marcus, who stood watching the scene unfold with the stoic resignation of a man who had seen it all before. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm Aisha Johnson. My father served in Desert Storm. I recognize your medal, and I want you to know not everyone here agrees with how you're being treated." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, a spark of surprise, perhaps even hope. "Thank you," he murmured. "I appreciate that more than you know." Aisha nodded toward her phone. "I'm live streaming this. People are already recognizing the Medal of Honor. If you're comfortable sharing your name, it might help identify you so veterans online can confirm your service." Marcus considered for a moment. "Major Marcus Washington," he said finally. "United States Army, retired, Vietnam." Aisha repeated the information for her viewers, and within seconds, comments began flooding in from veterans and military history, buffs who recognized the name. "Major Washington is legit," one wrote. "He saved 12 men during an ambush in '69. Another added, "I saw him at a veterans event last year. This is outrageous." The tide of public opinion was turning, flowing through Aisha's live stream and crashing against the wall of prejudice that had been constructed around Marcus. The security officers and airport staff, however, remained unmoved by the growing evidence that they had gravely misjudged the situation. Instead, they doubled down, their pride preventing them from acknowledging their mistake. As Aisha's live stream counter hit 1,000 viewers, then 5,000, then 20,000, she realized that she was no longer just a witness to injustice. She had become its opposition, standing alongside a hero who had already fought more battles than most could imagine. The dense jungle of Vietnam's Central Highlands closed around 19-year-old Private First Class Marcus Washington like a living thing, hot and suffocating in the summer of 1969. His unit, Alpha Company of the 25th Infantry Division, had been on patrol for 6 days, each man carrying 80 pounds of equipment through terrain that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. Marcus wiped sweat from his eyes, careful to maintain his position in the patrol formation. As they moved through a narrow ravine, 2 men ahead of him walked Richard Collins, a white private from rural Georgia, who had made his feelings about serving alongside black soldiers abundantly clear from the moment they'd arrived in country. Collins had refused to share a foxhole. With Marcus during their first week, had accidentally spilled his rations more than once, and made a point of using racial slurs just loudly enough for Marcus to hear. But Vietnam had a way of reshaping men's priorities. After their first firefight, when Marcus had dragged a wounded soldier to safety under heavy fire, Collins had begun to look at him differently. Not with respect exactly, but with a grudging acknowledgement of his competence. By the 3rd month of their deployment, Collins had stopped going out of his way to antagonize Marcus, and by the 5th month, they had developed a wary coexistence that occasionally veered towards something like camaraderie. They were in the 6th month of their tour when the ambush hit. The first sign was the distinctive crack of an AK-47, followed immediately by the thud of bullets striking flesh. The point man went down, and chaos erupted as hidden enemy forces opened fire from 3 sides. "Contact left," someone shouted, and the ravine filled with the deafening exchange of gunfire. Marcus dropped to his stomach, crawling toward a fallen log for cover. Through the smoke and confusion, he saw Collins pinned down in an exposed position, desperately returning fire as bullets kicked up dirt around him. Without hesitation, Marcus broke cover, sprinting in a crouch toward Collins and diving into position beside him. "We gotta move," he shouted over the cacophony. "This position's too exposed." Collins nodded, his face streaked with dirt and fear. "On 3. Together they made a dash for better cover, sliding into a shallow depression behind a cluster of boulders. From this vantage point, Marcus could see that their unit was in serious trouble. The lieutenant was down, the radio operator was hit, and the enemy had the high ground on all sides. It was a textbook ambush, and the textbook said they were as good as dead. Marcus checked his ammunition, 3 magazines left. He looked at Collins, who was bandaging a graze wound on his arm. "Radio?" Marcus asked, and Collins shook his head. "Operator's down, and I think the radio took a hit." Marcus surveyed the battlefield again, spotting at least 4 wounded men in positions too exposed for medics to reach them. The enemy fire was concentrated on those positions, preventing any rescue attempt. In that moment, something crystallized in Marcus's mind, a clarity of purpose that cut through the fear and chaos. "Cover me," he said to Collins, who stared at him in disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about, Washington?" "Those men need help. I'm going to create a diversion. On the left flank. When they shift fire to me, the medics can reach the wounded." Collins grabbed his arm. "That's suicide, man." Marcus met his eyes. "Maybe. But those men are dying for sure if somebody doesn't do something." Before Collins could argue further, Marcus was moving, staying low as he worked his way toward the left flank. When he reached position, he took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and then launched his one-man assault. Firing in controlled bursts, moving quickly from position to position, he created the impression of a much larger force. The tactic worked. Enemy fire began to concentrate on his position, allowing medics to reach the wounded men on the other side of the ravine. For 15 minutes, Marcus maintained his diversion, even as bullets tore through the foliage around him. He was preparing to fall back when he heard a cry of pain from nearby. Collins had attempted to join him and taken a hit in the process. Without hesitation, Marcus broke cover again, sprinting to Collins's position. The larger man was bleeding heavily from a chest wound, his face pale with shock. "Hang on," Marcus told him, slinging Collins's arm over his shoulder and beginning the agonizing process of dragging him to safety. They had almost reached the American position when the mortar round hit. Marcus awoke to the sound of helicopter, rotors, and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. His left leg was immobilized and pain radiated from what felt like 100 different wounds. But his first thought was of Collins. "Where's Collins?" he asked the medic bending over him. The man glanced toward another stretcher, where Collins lay motionless, an oxygen mask over his face. "He's hanging in there, but it's touch and go. He wouldn't be alive at all if you hadn't got him out when you did." In the field hospital later, Marcus learned the full extent of what had happened. After the mortar hit, despite being severely wounded himself, he had continued to shield Collins with his own body, returning fire and holding off the enemy until reinforcements arrived. In addition to Collins, he had saved the lives of 11 other men from his unit. The action would earn him the Medal of Honor, but at the time, all that mattered to Marcus was whether Collins would survive. For 3 days, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness in the hospital. When he was finally lucid enough to ask about Collins again, a nurse directed him to a bed across the ward. Against medical advice, Marcus insisted on being wheeled to his squadmate's side. Collins was conscious but weak, his normally robust frame diminished by trauma and surgery. When he saw Marcus, something changed in his expression, a softening, a recognition. "You crazy son of a bitch," Collins whispered. "Why'd you come back for me?" Marcus shrugged, wincing at the pain the simple gesture caused. "Wouldn't leave anyone out there." Collins was quiet for a long moment. "I was wrong about you," he said finally. "About a lot of things." It was the beginning of a transformation. During their recovery, Collins became Marcus's staunchest defender, confronting anyone who directed racial slurs or discrimination toward his friend. When they returned to the United States 6 months later, Collins invited Marcus to stay with his family in Georgia, an invitation that shocked both Marcus and Collins's relatives. The visit was tense, uncomfortable at times, but it marked the beginning of Collins's family's own journey toward unlearning generations of prejudice. When Marcus received his Medal of Honor, Collins was there, standing proudly as President Nixon placed the medal around his friend's neck. But the medal didn't shield Marcus from the discrimination that awaited him in civilian life. Despite his heroism, he returned to a country still deeply divided by race. Job interviews that went well over the phone mysteriously dried up when employers saw his face. Banks denied him loans. Restaurants seated him by the kitchen. Through it all, Collins remained his friend and ally, sometimes the only white face willing to stand beside him in environments hostile to his presence. When Collins died of cancer in 1990, his last request was for Marcus to have his service medals. "You showed me what those values really mean," Collins told him in their final conversation. "Honor, courage, commitment. You lived them when I was just wearing them on my uniform." As he lay dying, Collins extracted a promise from Marcus. "Keep living with honor, Wash. Don't let the bastards grind you down. Someday they'll all see you like I do." In the decades following Collins's death, Marcus had dedicated himself to quiet advocacy for black veterans, working behind the scenes to ensure they received the benefits and recognition they deserved. He never sought the spotlight, preferring to influence policy through persistence and the moral authority his Medal of Honor afforded him. His invitation to the White House was connected to a new initiative for veterans that he had helped shape, a program specifically designed to address the unique challenges faced by veterans of color. As Marcus reflected on this history, standing in Atlanta International Airport, while security officers questioned his identity and his right to the honors he had earned with blood, he wondered what Collins would say if he could see this scene. Probably something profane, followed by action. Collins had never been one to stand quietly in the face of injustice, not after Vietnam had stripped away his inherited prejudices and shown him the true measure of a man. Marcus touched the watch on his wrist, Collins's watch, given to him by Collins's widow after the funeral. "I'm still living with honor, Rich," he thought, "even when it would be easier not to." James Watkins' hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number. As an Air Force ROTC cadet, working part-time at the airport while completing his degree, he had memorized the protocol for reporting incidents involving military personnel, but he had never imagined he would need to use it. "Department of Defense, how may I direct your call?" a crisp voice answered. "This is James Watkins at Atlanta International Airport," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "I need to report an incident involving a Medal of Honor recipient." There was a brief pause. "Go ahead." James described the scene unfolding at Gate 27, the elderly black veteran being publicly humiliated, his identification questioned, his medal handled carelessly by security personnel who clearly didn't recognize its significance. "His name is Major Marcus Washington," James concluded. "He identified himself as a Vietnam veteran." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Stay where you are, Mr. Watkins," the voice finally responded, with a new note of urgency. "Do not intervene further at this time. Someone will contact you shortly." The call ended and James stared at his phone, wondering if he had done enough, or perhaps too much. He had no way of knowing that his call had set in motion a reaction that was rapidly moving up the military chain of command. At the Pentagon, the duty officer who took James's call immediately escalated the information to his superior, who recognized Marcus Washington's name instantly. Within minutes, the report reached the office of the Secretary of Defense, where it landed like a bombshell. Major Marcus Washington was not just any Medal of Honor recipient. He was a living legend whose exploits in Vietnam had been studied at West Point and whose quiet advocacy for veterans had influenced military policy for decades. The fact that he was being detained and disrespected at a civilian airport while traveling to receive a presidential commendation was not merely an embarrassment, it was an affront to the military itself. "Get me the head of airport security at Atlanta International," the Secretary of Defense barked to his aide, "and contact the FBI field office in Atlanta. I want agents on site immediately." Meanwhile, at the airport, Marcus Washington was being escorted away from the gate by security, his dignity intact, but his heart heavy with familiar disappointment. His flight to Washington, D.C. had begun boarding, passengers filing past with curious glances at the elderly black man surrounded by security officers. The Medal of Honor and his military IDs remained in the possession of the officers, who continued to treat these sacred items with casual disregard. Karen Miller watched from her position at the gate, a smug expression on her face as she welcomed first-class passengers aboard, passengers who, in her mind, belonged there in a way that Marcus Washington did not. Behind her, the monitor displayed the flight information. United Airlines Flight 1056 to Washington, D.C., on time for an 11:15 departure. What none of them realized was that this flight would not be departing on time. Not even close. At the Pentagon, phones were ringing across multiple departments as word spread about the situation in Atlanta. General William Hayes, a four-star general and the Army's second highest-ranking officer, was in a meeting when his aide interrupted with the news. Hayes, a black man himself, whose father had served in Vietnam alongside Marcus Washington, immediately stood up. "Get my plane ready," he ordered, "and contact the Atlanta field office. I want vehicles on standby when I land." In the executive offices of Atlanta International Airport, the CEO's phone rang. The caller identified himself as the Secretary of Defense of the United States. "We have a situation at your facility," the Secretary began without preamble. "The national hero is being detained by your security staff, and I need it resolved immediately." The CEO listened, his face paling as the Secretary continued. "Major Marcus Washington is scheduled to meet with the President tomorrow. He carries a Medal of Honor that he earned saving 12 American lives in Vietnam. If he misses his flight because your staff couldn't recognize a legitimate military ID, the consequences will be severe." By the time the call ended, The CEO was already running toward the elevator, shouting for his security director to meet him at gate 27. Simultaneously, Aisha Johnson's live stream had grown to over 100,000 viewers, including journalists from major networks who were now calling their Atlanta affiliates to get camera crews to the airport. Veterans organizations were mobilizing online, with members who lived near Atlanta pledging to head to the airport immediately. Social media was erupting with outrage as the story spread, accompanied by screenshots from Aisha's live stream showing the disrespectful handling of the Medal of Honor. All of these reactions were converging on Atlanta International Airport like a gathering storm, while Marcus Washington, the man at the center of it all, continued to maintain his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation, just as he had done countless times throughout his life. Have you ever witnessed someone being unfairly treated because of their race or appearance? Comment number 1 if you've spoken up in such situations, or number 2 if you regret staying silent. Hit that like button if you believe our veterans deserve better treatment regardless of their skin color. Subscribe now to see what happens when the full weight of military authority descends on Atlanta International Airport. The gate agent and security officers thought they were dealing with an elderly man they could dismiss without consequences, but who was about to arrive at the airport in 9 minutes that would change everything. 9 minutes after James Watkins made his call to the Pentagon, the first signs of an extraordinary response began to manifest at Atlanta International Airport. Airport operations received an unprecedented communication from the FAA. Temporary ground stop initiated at Atlanta International. All departing flights hold positions. Incoming priority government aircraft cleared for immediate landing on runway 27R. In the airport's control tower, controllers exchanged bewildered glances as they implemented the order, bringing one of the nation's busiest airports to a virtual standstill. On the ground, the first black SUV appeared at the security checkpoint, bypassing the regular lanes as federal credentials were flashed at startled TSA agents. Then another SUV arrived and another, forming a convoy that moved with purposeful speed through the terminal complex. Airport police scrambled to clear a path, though they themselves had no idea what was happening. At gate 27, Marcus Washington sat on a hard plastic chair, a security officer standing over him, while the airport manager spoke urgently into her phone. The manager's expression transformed from irritation to shock to something approaching terror as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, sir," she stammered. "I understand. Yes, right away." She hung up and turned to Karen Miller, her face ashen. "Where are his documents?" she demanded. "His military ID and the medal. Where are they?" Karen blinked in confusion. "Security has them. Why? What's—" The manager cut her off. "Get them back here immediately. All of them. Undamaged." She turned to the security officers. "Return Major Washington's belongings to him at once and escort him to the VIP lounge." The officers hesitated, looking at each other in confusion. "Ma'am," one began, but the manager cut him off with uncharacteristic sharpness. "That was the CEO of the entire airport authority. Major Washington is to be treated with the utmost respect, effective immediately. His flight is being held, and you two are to ensure he boards comfortably." Before the officers could respond, the terminal doors burst open and 4 men in dark suits entered, their bearing and coordinated movements immediately identifying them as federal agents. Behind them came 6 military police officers in full uniform, flanking a tall black man whose 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders. General William Hayes had arrived, and his expression promised consequences. The crowd at the gate parted instinctively as the general strode forward, his eyes locked on Marcus Washington. The security officers stiffened to attention, belatedly recognizing the authority before them. Marcus rose slowly to his feet as General Hayes approached, military instinct bringing him to attention, despite the decades since his active service. "At ease, Major," Hayes said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent gate area. "I apologize for the delay in our response." Marcus relaxed his posture slightly. "General Hayes," he acknowledged with a nod, "this is unexpected. Not as unexpected as learning that a Medal of Honor recipient was being detained on his way to meet the president, Hayes replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. He turned to face the security officers and airport staff. "Where are Major Washington's effects?" One of the officers fumbled in his pocket, producing the velvet case containing the Medal of Honor and the military IDs. Hayes held out his hand, and the officer placed them in his palm with visible reluctance. Hayes inspected the medal carefully, before returning it to Marcus with a formal nod of respect. "Appears undamaged, sir," he said, "unlike your treatment here today." The airport manager stepped forward, practically tripping over herself in her haste to make amends. "General Hayes, I want to assure you that Atlanta International deeply regrets this unfortunate misunderstanding. We will be conducting a full investigation into how this occurred, and appropriate measures will be taken." Hayes regarded her coldly. "I should hope so. The President is expecting a report on this incident by tomorrow morning." At the mention of the President, Karen Miller, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror, finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of her error. Her face drained of color as one of the federal agents approached her. "Ms. Miller?" the agent asked, though it wasn't really a question. "We'll need to take a statement from you regarding today's events." Two more black SUVs pulled up outside the terminal, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. From one emerged a man in an Air Force dress uniform with the insignia of a lieutenant general. From the other stepped the CEO of the airline, who had been contacted directly by the Secretary of Transportation. The ripples of James Watkins's phone call were still expanding, drawing in higher levels of authority with each passing minute. The runway operations at Atlanta International remained frozen, with no aircraft permitted to depart until Major Marcus Washington's situation was resolved to the military's satisfaction. Passengers throughout the terminal were documenting the unprecedented scene on their phones. The line of black SUVs outside, the military and federal personnel converging on Gate 27, the generals in full uniform standing in the boarding area. Aisha Johnson continued her live stream, which had now grown to over 1 million viewers. "I'm still at Atlanta International Airport," she narrated quietly, "where what began as discrimination against an elderly black veteran has escalated into what looks like a federal intervention. Multiple high-ranking military officers have arrived, and the airport appears to be in some kind of lockdown." General Hayes turned to Marcus, his voice softening slightly. "Major Washington, a car is waiting to take you directly to Andrews Air Force Base, where a private flight to D.C. has been arranged. The President sends his personal apologies for this incident and looks forward to seeing you tomorrow as planned." Marcus shook his head gently. "With all due respect, General, I'd prefer to take my scheduled flight, if it's still possible. I don't need special treatment, just the respect I've earned." Hayes studied the older man for a moment, then nodded with understanding. "As you wish, Major. Your flight will depart as soon as we've concluded our business here." He turned, back to the assembled airport staff. "I trust there will be no further issues with Major Washington's boarding." The airport manager shook her head vigorously. "Absolutely not, General. We'll ensure Major Washington has every comfort during his flight." General Hayes stood at the center of Gate 27, his commanding presence drawing all eyes as he addressed the assembled passengers and airport staff. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with authority that silenced even the most restless travelers, "I feel it necessary to clarify exactly who stands among you today, since there seems to have been some confusion." He gestured toward Marcus Washington, who maintained his dignified bearing despite the tumultuous events of the morning. "This is Major Marcus Washington, United States Army, retired. In 1969, during the Vietnam War, Major Washington's unit was ambushed in hostile territory. Outnumbered and surrounded, with multiple wounded soldiers unable to reach safety, then Private First Class Washington single-handedly created a diversion that drew enemy fire away from his comrades." Hayes paused, allowing his words to sink in. The terminal had grown so quiet that the distant sounds of aircraft could be heard through the thick glass windows. For 15 minutes, he maintained this diversion alone, allowing medics to reach the wounded. When he saw that one of his squad mates had been hit trying to join him, Major Washington broke cover, exposing himself to concentrated enemy fire to drag his wounded comrade to safety. The general's eyes swept across the crowd, noting the expressions of shock and growing respect on the faces of those who had earlier looked at Marcus with suspicion or disdain. Despite being severely wounded himself in a mortar attack, Major Washington continued to shield his comrade with his own body while returning fire until reinforcements arrived. His actions that day saved the lives of 12 American soldiers. Hayes turned to one of his aides, who handed him a tablet. The general tapped the screen a few times, then held it up. This citation was read as, "President Nixon placed the Medal of Honor around Private First Class Washington's neck in 1971. He began to read, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Private First Class Marcus Washington distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action against hostile forces. His valor and selfless devotion to his fellow soldiers reflect the highest traditions of the United States Army." Throughout, the terminal digital displays normally used for flight information suddenly switched to show Marcus's military record and commendations, including photographs from the Medal of Honor ceremony. The airport's technical team, desperate to make amends, had patched the images through at the CEO's frantic direction. Hayes handed the tablet back to his aide. But Major Washington's service to his country didn't end when he left the battlefield. For the past 50 years, he has worked tirelessly on behalf of veterans, particularly homeless veterans, and those struggling with PTSD. His advocacy has shaped policies that have improved the lives of thousands of former service members. The general turned to look directly at Marcus. Tomorrow, Major Washington is scheduled to receive the Presidential Citizens Medal for his decades of service to the veteran community. This will make him one of only a handful of Americans to have received both the nation's highest military honor and its second highest civilian recognition. A murmur of awe spread through the crowd. Karen Miller, standing at the counter with federal agents on either side of her, looked as though she might be sick. The security officers who had questioned Marcus's identification and manhandled his medal stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. General Hayes wasn't finished. "I have a personal connection to Major Washington's story that few people know," he continued. "My father, Sergeant James Hayes, was one of the 12 men Major Washington saved that day in Vietnam. My father was a 20-year-old radio operator with a pregnant wife back home, my mother. Had Major Washington not acted with extraordinary courage that day, I would not be standing before you." A collective gasp rippled through the gate area. The general's revelation added a powerful personal dimension to the story that transformed it from abstract heroism to something immediate and tangible. "I grew up hearing about Major Washington's bravery," Hayes continued. "My father spoke of him often, how a young black soldier from Detroit had risked everything to save men, who, in many cases, had shown him nothing but prejudice since their arrival in Vietnam. My father said it changed him forever, made him reevaluate everything he'd been taught about race." At these words, Marcus's stoic expression softened slightly. He had never known that one of the men he saved had carried his story forward, passing it to the next generation as a lesson in courage and character. The general turned to address Karen and the security officers directly. "In light of today's events, Atlanta International Airport has agreed to implement immediate training for all staff on proper recognition of military identification and appropriate handling of decorated veterans. The individuals directly involved in this incident have been placed on administrative leave pending further review." This was news to Karen, whose face crumpled as the reality of her situation finally hit home. One of the federal agents leaned toward her and said something in a low voice that caused her to nod shakily. The airport manager stepped forward. "Additionally," she announced, her voice trembling slightly, "the airport authority will be making a substantial donation to Major Washington's Veterans Foundation as a gesture of our sincere regret for today's events." Throughout all of this, Aisha Johnson had continued her live stream, which had now reached over 1 million viewers and was being picked up by major news networks. As she narrated the unfolding events, comments flooded in from veterans, active duty, military personnel and civilians alike, expressing outrage at Marcus's treatment and admiration for his service and dignity. James Watkins, the young airport employee whose phone call had set these events in motion, stood to the side, watching with a mixture of awe and satisfaction. General Hayes noticed him and gestured for him to approach. "Mr. Watkins," he said, extending his hand, "the Department of Defense appreciates your actions today. You saw an injustice and took appropriate steps to address it, despite potential risk to your position here." James shook the general's hand, standing at attention as his ROTC training kicked in. "Thank you, sir. I just did what seemed right." Hayes nodded approvingly. "That's precisely what we look for in our officers. I understand you're in Air Force ROTC. Consider this an official commendation in your record. Additionally, I'd like to offer you a full scholarship for the remainder of your education, courtesy of the Department of Defense." James's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, Thank you, sir." As these conversations continued, Marcus reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn photograph which he handed to General Hayes. "Your father is in this picture," he said quietly. "Third from the left." The photograph showed a group of young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, standing before a jungle backdrop. Hayes studied it, then pointed to a skinny white soldier with a radio on his back. "That's him," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus nodded. "Richard Collins is next to him," he said, indicating a taller white soldier. "He was my best friend. He died in my arms during that ambush, but not before he changed my life." He took back the photograph, handling it with reverence. "Richard was from rural Georgia. When we first met, he wouldn't even speak to me except to use racial slurs. By the time of the ambush, he'd become my brother in every way that mattered." Marcus's voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected decades of carried pain. "His last words to me were, 'They got to see you now, Wash. They got to see you for who you really are.'" He looked around at the gathered crowd, at the digital displays, showing his younger self receiving the Medal of Honor, at the respect now evident in the eyes of people who had dismissed him just minutes earlier. "Some days I think he was right," Marcus said. "Other days, like today, I wonder if anything has really changed." The boarding process for United Airlines Flight 1056 to Washington, D.C. resumed with a decidedly different atmosphere than when it had begun. An honor guard of military personnel lined the jetway, standing at attention as Major Marcus Washington made his way onto the aircraft. Behind him walked General Hayes, who had insisted on personally escorting the Medal of Honor recipient to his seat. As Marcus stepped onto the plane, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, United Airlines is honored to have Major Marcus Washington, Medal of Honor recipient, joining us on our flight to Washington, D.C. today. Major. Washington is traveling to receive the Presidential Citizens Medal for his lifetime of service to veterans." The passengers already seated rose as one, breaking into spontaneous applause as Marcus made his way down the aisle. Many reached out to shake his hand or simply touch his shoulder as he passed, murmuring thanks for his service. The flight attendants, who had been hastily briefed on the situation, greeted him with profound respect, escorting him to his first-class seat with a deference that stood in stark contrast to his earlier treatment at the gate. Back in the terminal, the consequences of the morning's events were unfolding rapidly. Karen Miller had been formally terminated from her position, effective immediately. As she was escorted from the premises by airport security, the same officers who had earlier been her willing accomplices in humiliating Marcus, she was informed that the airline would be conducting a full investigation into her history, thorough customer interactions, focusing particularly on any patterns of discriminatory behavior. The security officers who had questioned Marcus's identification and mishandled his Medal of Honor were placed on unpaid administrative leave, with the airport authority already reaching out to a respected civil rights organization to develop new training protocols addressing racial bias. The incident had sparked a firestorm across social media and news outlets. Aisha Johnson's livestream had been picked up by major networks, with clips showing the disrespectful treatment of the elderly black veteran juxtaposed against images of his Medal of Honor ceremony and General Hayes's impassioned address. Veterans, groups across the country were issuing statements of support for Marcus, and condemnation of his treatment, with many calling for broader examination of how veterans of color were treated in civilian settings. In response to the rapidly escalating situation, the Atlanta International Airport CEO announced the immediate formation of a task force to review and revise all training materials and protocols related to military identification and the treatment of veterans. A statement released to the press emphasized the airport's commitment to ensuring that such an incident would never occur again and acknowledged the deep institutional failures that had allowed it to happen in the first place. Today's events represent a painful learning opportunity, the statement read. Atlanta International Airport acknowledges that Major Washington was subjected to treatment that was not only disrespectful to his status as a Medal of Honor recipient, but was tainted by racial bias that has no place in our facility or our society. We are committed to making meaningful, substantive changes to address these issues at their root. For James Watkins, the young airport employee whose call had initiated the federal response, the day marked an unexpected turning point in his life. In addition to the scholarship offered by General Hayes, he received commendations from veterans organizations and was invited to attend the Presidential Citizens Medal ceremony at the White House. His ROTC commanders informed him that his actions demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and leadership they sought to develop in future officers. As Flight 1056 prepared for departure, Marcus sat quietly in his first-class seat, processing the whirlwind of events that had transformed what should have been a routine journey into a national incident. Beside him, General Hayes spoke in low tones, filling him in on the reactions from Washington and the arrangements being made for his arrival. "The President has been briefed on the situation," Hayes explained. "He's expanded tomorrow's ceremony to include the announcement of a new executive order strengthening protections for veterans of color and addressing systemic discrimination in veterans' services." Marcus nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of the response to his mistreatment. "All this because one young man made a phone call," he observed, "reminds me of something Richard used to say, that it only takes one person willing to stand up for what's right to change everything." Hayes smiled. "That's what I've always tried to teach my officers. Moral courage is rarer and more valuable than physical courage." As the plane taxied toward the runway, Marcus looked out the window at the terminal where, just an hour earlier, he had stood alone against familiar prejudice. Now a crowd had gathered at the windows, many holding hastily made signs expressing support and gratitude. Among them he could see Aisha Johnson, still documenting everything on her phone, and James Watkins, standing tall in his ROTC uniform. For the first time that day, Marcus allowed himself a genuine smile. The plane took off into the clear blue sky, leaving Atlanta behind. Marcus leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly as the events of the day caught up with him. When he opened them again, he found himself thinking of Richard Collins, wondering what his friend would have made of all this. Perhaps Richard had been right after all. Perhaps people were finally beginning to see him for who he really was, not just the color of his skin. The next day, Marcus stood in the East Room of the White House as the President placed the Presidential Citizens Medal around his neck. The ceremony had indeed been expanded, with the President directly addressing the incident at Atlanta International Airport and using it as a catalyst to announce new initiatives combating discrimination against veterans of color. "Major Washington has served this country with extraordinary valor and distinction," the President declared. "That he should face the indignity of racial discrimination while traveling to receive this honor is a painful reminder of how much work remains to be done. Today we not only recognize his lifetime of service, but pledge to honor that service by building a more just society for all who have worn the uniform." Following the ceremony, Marcus did something he had postponed for 50 years. With General Hayes accompanying him, he traveled to Arlington National Cemetery, where Richard Collins had been laid to rest after succumbing to cancer. Standing before the simple white headstone, Marcus removed the Presidential Citizens Medal from around his neck and placed it gently against the marble. "I kept my promise, Rich," he said softly. "I lived with honor, even when it wasn't easy. I think maybe people are starting to see me the way you did." all those years ago. He stood in silence for several minutes, General Hayes keeping a respectful distance. As they turned to leave, they noticed a group of young military cadets touring the cemetery, a diverse group of young men and women representing every race and background. One of them, a young black woman, recognized Marcus from the news coverage and approached hesitantly. "Major Washington," she asked. "Sir, would you mind speaking with us for a moment? We're all training to become officers, and after what happened yesterday, well, we could learn a lot from you about dignity and leadership." Marcus looked at the eager young faces before him, seeing in them the future of a military, and perhaps a country, that might finally fulfill its promise of equality and respect for all who served. "I'd be honored," he replied, and as he began to share his stories with the next generation of leaders, he felt Richard's presence beside him, nodding in approval. What happened at Atlanta International Airport had begun as yet another instance of the discrimination Marcus had faced throughout his life. But unlike so many previous incidents that had been endured in silence, this one had sparked a national conversation and concrete actions to address the underlying issues. It wasn't the end of the struggle. Marcus was too experienced, too wise to believe that, but it was a step forward, another small battle won in the long war for equality and respect. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up against discrimination, like James and Aisha did for Major Washington? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit the like button to help more people learn about the real challenges our veterans of color still face today. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the ongoing work toward justice. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear this message of courage, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Major Washington's extraordinary story. AC. Reminder that true heroism isn't just found on the battlefield, but in the quiet dignity with which we face life's daily injustices. Major Washington's story teaches us profound lessons about dignity, respect, and the ongoing struggle against discrimination. Despite his Medal of Honor and lifetime of service, he faced the same racial prejudice that has shadowed countless Americans of color. His response, maintaining composure and dignity rather than matching hostility with hostility, demonstrates extraordinary strength of character that transcends the battlefield heroism that earned his medal. The story also highlights how institutional bias operates. Authorities automatically sided with Karen against Marcus without investigation, showing how prejudice becomes embedded in systems and procedures. Yet we also witness the power of individual action through James and Aisha. One phone call, one live stream. These simple acts of moral courage dramatically altered the outcome and sparked meaningful change. Their willingness to stand up when witnessing injustice reminds us that we all have this power. Finally, Richard Collins' transformation from prejudiced Southerner to devoted friend illustrates that change is possible, that people can unlearn harmful beliefs when they see the humanity in those they've been taught to dismiss. This may be the most hopeful lesson. Hearts and minds can change when given the opportunity to recognize the true measure of a person beyond the color of their skin. Has someone ever judged you based on your appearance rather than your character? Or have you witnessed discrimination and wondered if you should speak up? Major Washington's story reminds us that dignity can be a powerful response to prejudice, and that one person's courage can spark meaningful change. Share your experiences in the comments below. We can learn from each other's stories. If this account of quiet dignity in the face of discrimination moved you, please hit that like button to help amplify these important conversations. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that challenge us to examine our biases and stand up for what's right. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message about respecting our veterans of all backgrounds, please share this video with them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Major Washington's extraordinary story. May we all find the courage to be more like James and Aisha when we witness injustice in our daily lives.